Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live. I am your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we are delighted to have with us Benjamin Weber in conversation with Christopher Paul Harris. We are celebrating the launch and publication of Benjamin Weber's new book, American Purgatory, Prison Imperialism and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. It is published by the New Press. Christopher Paul Harris also has a new book that was recently published, To Build a Black Future, The Radical Politics of Joy, Pain, and Care, published by our friends at Princeton University Press. There are strong threads that connect the work of both of these scholars in their respective areas of study. City Lights has had the great pleasure of championing their works, and we feel they're addressing very clearly and powerfully the issues related to the struggle for justice in this country, as well as the world. As Benjamin Weber points out in his book, the American prison system is inextricably linked to the expansion of American power around the globe. The insight, thoughtfulness, and visionary outlook of both our guests contribute greatly to the national discussion regarding Black politics, protest, and political thought at this crucial moment in history. Hence, we are very, very excited about this evening's program. Before we begin, as is customary, I would like to remind everyone that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. I would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Benjamin Weber is an assistant professor of African American and African Studies at the University of California at Davis. He has worked at the Vera Institute of Justice, Alternate Roots, the Marcus Garvey and UNIA Papers Project, and has a public high school teacher as taught in East Los Angeles. He makes his home in Davis, California. Christopher Paul Harris is an assistant professor in the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California at Irvine. His research interests range from Black political thought, cultural aesthetics, and social movements to broader questions concerning the possibility of revolutionary transformation in the 21st century. To Build a Black Future is his first book and draws upon his experiences as an activist and organizer inside the movement for Black lives. Really, it's such a great pleasure to be able to offer a warm welcome to Benjamin Weber and Christopher Paul Harris. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for organizing this.
Brett, let me start by saying congratulations, Ben. What a wonderful achievement your book is, and it's been a pleasure to read, and I'm excited for this conversation.
Congrats to you too. I'm just finished it, and we were chatting a little bit before this started, but wow, Chris, I mean, this is the book that my students need, that the activists need, that we all need now. And so it is such an honor to be in conversation with you, Ben, to get to do this with all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I feel the same way about yours. And so we decided that to get started, we will read a paragraph that each of us were drawn to in the other's book, and then we'll begin the conversation. So I am going to read from the first chapter of American Purgatory, and that chapter is called Prisons and Placemaking, on page 8, if anyone wants to follow along, the bottom of page 8. So the Battle of Negro Fort was a battle over placemaking. With a deadly preemptive strike in foreign territory, the federal government committed itself to an imperial policy path that would eventually spread forts, bases, and prisons throughout continental North America, across the Pacific, and all over the world. The invasion of Florida targeted the destruction of a powerful symbol of Black and Indigenous freedom. In its place, federal officials laid the groundwork for the Monroe Doctrine, the National Indian Removal Policy, and the infamous Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling, demonstrating that the allocation of rights, persecution of alleged criminals, and treatment of prisoners would all be racially differentiated. The story of the Black Fort uncovers how understanding the root causes of the contemporary crisis of over-imprisonment is not only about what prisons purported to contain, but also about what they covered over, the unrealized possibilities that were caged in, killed off, and otherwise foreclosed. It's a powerful paragraph.
Thanks, Chris. And I hope this isn't confusing, but I am now reading a paragraph from his book that resonated with me. And then at the end of our conversation, we'll each read a little bit from our own book. And also, I don't know if Peter mentioned, but we'll do a Q&A at the end from the chat. So be thinking of questions, put your questions in the chat. Peter will jump back in and read some of those, share some of those with us. So we're excited for all of your wonderful questions as well. And so for those of you that have this book, this is Chris's book, To Build a Black Future, The Radical Politics of Joy, Pain, and Care. And I think, I'll read this paragraph, but one of the things that's so beautiful about this book is how he shows how those things, joy, pain, care, are made material by young people at the vanguard of this groundswell of movement building. And so this paragraph that I chose is from chapter 4, A Joyful Rebellion. And it starts, Black joy, the singing, dancing, and chants, the ad-libs and improvised movements, the culture. If Black pain is a spindle around which the capitalist world system weaves its thread, abolishing that system through the adoption of a praxis invested in, as Dylan Rodriguez suggests, a radical reconfiguration of justice, subjectivity, and social formation, disentangled from the captive logics that ground the totality of state-sanctioned and extra-state relations of gendered, racial, colonial dominance, is the highest form of regard. It's the mechanism by which we build a Black future. And then he goes on to write, to make such a claim is one thing, to actualize it is another, and on that front, Black joy plays an essential role. And so, yeah, with that kind of introduction to these two books, we're gonna talk about these books. And so I'll start. And one thing, I was thinking about as I read the book is the tribute that you make to your late father, and the way that you weave in kind of ancestral wisdom, the way that you channel that throughout the book, and the way that you make the case that art, culture, and politics are inseparable. And so I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about your own experience touring the country as a musician, and how that shaped your approach to your activism and your scholarship, and also a little bit about the intergenerational dimension of your work.
Great, yeah, thank you for that question. It's funny, when I first started doing these events, I imagined that everybody would just kind of skip over that part because it's very subtle.
You called it life-changing.
Oh, I guess I did. So I've been forced to kind of talk about it more, and I've was hesitant at first, but now I'm more excited to. I think there are two dimensions to this that are important to the work. One is kind of substance-wise, and one is about form. So towards the substance, touring was a grind, and we were doing everything, DIY, renting a minivan and driving ourselves, and we had very little money. So the way that we were able to manage is by couch surfing. That I don't think it exists anymore, but people of a certain age will remember that phenomena. You would reach out to people and ask to stay, and they would let you. And so the point of that is not to talk about how poor we were and doing the DIY thing, but it's to say that being able to stay at people's houses brought us in greater contact and greater conversation with lots of people that we wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to talk to before or after the show on the same level. It was those conversations that inspired a desire to think generationally, to ask questions about generational politics. And that's where the project that would eventually become the book started. Thinking generationally, thinking about generational politics is also how I came into the Black Youth Project 100, because they are a Black-led organization, or Black-only organization, comprised of and for 18 to 35-year-olds. So they were very clearly thinking about this generational dynamic. And it was once I started in BYP 100 that I came to the conclusion that what I really wanted to write about was Black movement and Black thought, which itself is inherently intergenerational. I'll come back to that point in a moment. The second thing is about form. Right? As a musician, as a songwriter, as a singer, I came to academia with a desire to write more affectively, to channel whatever it was I was doing or trying to do as a musician and writing lyrics into the process of not just writing the book or learning how to write books, but also the form of it, asking the question, how can we make our writing, our books, sound and feel like listening to an album? And that's a major investment of mine. So without having been a musician and having that experience of touring the country, I might not have come to generational politics, which brought me to BYP 100. And I might not have been as invested as I am in writing as a craft rather than just to explain an argument. Very quickly on the intergenerational piece, if you understand, as I do, and as I'm sure you do, that Black political thought and Black movement is a conversation, right? To the world, a demand to the world, but also amongst other Black people. And one of the things that I was invested in and has been invested in trying to craft this book is to demonstrate that conversation. It's also something that's very vivid in movement spaces because we're, again, trying to learn from the past in order to pave a better future. And if you think about it, all Black movement has been an attempt to build a Black future. So let me ask you about how you came into your work and your project. And I was struck, I found it really interesting that in your preface, you mentioned that sifting through prison records in Manila was the starting point for you and this project. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why those prison records or how those prison records helped inspire you to spend what you describe as a decade studying the intersection between American prisons and American empire.
Yeah. I mean, that was certainly a spark. But I think it really started a decade earlier, even, in terms of thinking generationally and intergenerationally. I came of political age in the early 2000s with the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. So I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area with going to City Lights, involved in kind of racial justice and environmental justice movements. But the student walkouts, I was in high school in 2001, 2003, a decade before I was in Manila doing research. And I think that's when, coming of political age in an anti-war movement and realizing some of the stories that came out later, about like people like the police commander in Chicago, John Burge, who was a Gitmo interrogator who tortured people in Guantanamo and then tortured Black people in Chicago. Like those kind of, the way that the torture kind of moved through those sites of empire, like I knew that must have a history. And so, part of it is about when you come of political age. And so I've been really drawn to that aspect of your work too, talking about Black millennials, talking about the Trayvon generation, kind of what young people have, how they've come of age during and through the Black Lives Matter movement. And then, in college, my roommate was, his dad was a Black Studies professor, the late, great Clyde Woods. And so it was actually Clyde Woods's work that sent me in search of root causes and had that kind of framework for both, Black Studies framework for understanding the most challenging social and political problems of our time. Like I had studied history and politics, but it was really Black Studies was the missing framework for me. But yeah, so that kind of decade leading up to that moment where I was going through prison records in Manila, I was also teaching high school after college in East LA, and I could see and feel really acutely the way that certain neighborhoods were over-policed, the way that, that really resonated with what people, not just in the Black Panther movement, but in the Young Lords and the Brown Berets had described their neighborhoods as internal colonies, described overseas colonies as geographic prisons. you could see that in a really lived way. You know, I visited a lot of students who had been kind of arrested for being after curfew, had been profiled, had been, you know, just all the things that exist in over-policed neighborhoods. So I guess all that to say, a lot of things clicked for me in doing that PhD research and looking for the deeper history of how this, you know, crisis, you know, of our time, of certainly, you know, the as many of you know, the U.S. Incarcerates people at rates that are unprecedented in world history, at rates of racial disparity. So the racially targeted mass incarceration is the racial justice, social justice kind of crisis of our time. And so I think I knew that going into graduate school and trying to find both the kind of long and the broad view of that problem, as well as kind of try to lift up some of the solutions. And so, but in that moment, looking at those prison records, you know, I describe a little bit in the preface, but you know, just being drawn to their tattoos, the way that they're misread by the colonial police and whatnot. These are revolutionary anti-colonial fighters that are treated as criminals. And the other thing that was a huge aha moment there was the way that the U.S. colonial state described the search for messianic leaders. They're looking for a messiah. Some of you, you know, are probably familiar with Judas and the Black Messiah, the way that the FBI's illegal COINTELPRO program called Fred Hampton and other leaders of the Black Panther Party. You know, they were like, we must eradicate any potential Black Messiah capable of uniting and leading a revolutionary movement. That same language was happening at the turn of the 20th century in the Philippines, and again was happening with the attempts at putting down rebellions and revolts by enslaved people 100, you know, century before that. And so, yeah, part of that was really a spark. And then, you know, the more glib answer is that it shows up in the preface because editors and people that know a lot about books are like, put us in like in a place that people really associate with empire, like a far off place, you know? And so you make a series of choices when writing books. And I think, you know, all of that for a good reason, right? You are trying to tell a story, you're picking representative cases, and then you're weaving back in the less familiar. And so that's kind of a glib and a not so glib answer to that.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that. The Lake Clyde Woods, that was a turn I wasn't expecting you to take in your response. So it was nice to hear.
Yeah, it's really sweet. So we were here in New Orleans, and I.O. Scott is the artist who painted the cover painting and the portraits in this book. And his dad, John Scott, was a MacArthur Genius Grant Award-winning New Orleans artist, longtime professor at Xavier. But he did the cover, The Coming Storm, of Clyde Woods' book. So it was really sweet. Like my best friend's dad and then I.O.'s dad, we were here talking about that in the John T. Scott Center and in I.O.'s studio. And the cover of his other book, Development Arrested, is a John Biggers painting that's up in Dookie Chase's. And so we were there for lunch, and I.O. gave us the whole New Orleans art thing. And that was something, you know, that meant a lot to Clyde Woods, and that, you know, both in Development Arrested and Development Drowned and Reborn, but, you know, is so present in your work. Like I was scribbling, you know, blues epistemology in the margins, and, you know, the way that you talk about art and culture being so central to politics, and the way that you still retain a kind of revolutionary and liberationary framework as something that, you know, Clyde really pioneered. So so the intergenerational is coming through in another way. But yeah, tell us a little bit about your method and your citational practice. Like, I think this kind of follows from this too, but your citational practice is so rich and powerful. You're basically weaving together observation, interviews, this huge array of primary and secondary sources, And I feel like you just always have the perfect quote, or like you're like carefully curating and channeling the entire Black radical tradition, like everything that I certainly read in Black studies, and it's just so accessible and so you. And so just maybe tell us a little bit about your method, because you're doing incredible things and you're making it look very easy.
Well, thank you for that. I wish I could say that it's born out of a particular method, or at least one that I understood in advance, or that I knowingly pursued. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that it's about a certain kind of commitment, perhaps, right? And a kind of desire to arrange and bring things together in the service of speaking about Black movement and Black thought as vividly as I can. Going into this, there have been more and more books written about the movement, so this is less true than when I started, but there wasn't really a rendering of the movement from the position of Black thought, from the position of Black critical theory. And so from the get-go, there was that kind of commitment that I was going to try to tell this story of what I was observing using the ideas and the language of Black studies, because I believed that only Black studies and Black critical theory could speak to movement, that conversation that we were having. And it just happened to be serendipitous the way certain things came together, again, based on observations that and experiences that I was having in movement, and then noticing parallels between those observations in social media posts and platforms, and noticing those same parallels in Black critical theory that was coming out around the same time. And so wanting to, as I was saying, wanting to do justice to movement, and to make a book that was not just about movement, but was an example of movement in some kind of way, led me to put together the different strands of those observations I was just describing together, and make sure that I do that in conversation with Black studies and Black political thought over time, as a way of magnifying the idea of what Black political development, which is something I describe in the book, is, which is that conversation that we've been having with ourselves for centuries. One of the things that is also important to that, and very deeply important to my work in general, has been Black feminist thought and Black feminist thinking and Black writers. So I would Black writers who write through and with that tradition. And so I would be remiss if I didn't specifically say that a large part of the methodology behind the book, if you could call it that, is deeply embedded in a Black feminist praxis that's dedicated to understanding and moving towards and for the collective, right? So that's the other part of it, the kind of citational practice that I arrived at in the book. But I appreciate your kind words about what that looks like, even if it kind of happened rather than planned, right?
Conjuring.
Let's say that again, I'm sorry.
A conjuring of sorts, a curating.
Yeah, conjuring, a coming together, right? Kind of like a painter would, right? You have the colors that you want to use, but you're not exactly sure where they're going to go until you put them there. To bring it back to the cultural analogy, one of the things that is so powerful about your work, I think, is that on the one hand, it's called American Purgatory, right? And it could have simply rested as a critique, right, of what you term prison imperialism, which I hope you'll say more about. But it's just as much, if not more so, a book about resistance, right? And Black radicalism plays a significant role in the kind of interwoven protest traditions that you narrate. So why, for you, was it so critical to center protest traditions and amplify the voices of those who have struggled against prisons and empire, both at home and abroad, including, and this is another cool feature of the book, you like actually show pictures. You have some pictures of some of the people that you narrate, which I thought was a really nice touch.
Yeah. Those portraits are incredible in full color too. Like they're in black and white, but Iowa Scott did those portraits, and they are just so striking in full color. And so if you haven't had a chance to see them in full color, they're on my website and a few other places. But yeah. So I mean, part of it is what you're saying. There's a core commitment in Black studies to listen to and respond to wisdom from the ground up, from social movements. So part of it comes from a set of commitments, and then the way that I was trained in graduate school and the mentors that I was fortunate enough to have along the way. And then in particular, the stories of the people that are chosen as representative in these chapters are people who internationalize the struggle, because it's the kind of idea of protesting prison imperialism and the idea of learning from this movement building and this like centuries old conversation, as you're talking about, is to pick people that represent certain like trajectories of that, and they're all part of an imprisoned radical tradition. So they're all imprisoned intellectuals and activists. Some are Puerto Rican nationalists. Some are Black liberation folks, like you were mentioning. And two of those, in the kind of represent that stream of Black feminism that you're talking about. One of them is Claudia Jones, who in her biographer, Carol Boyce Davies, calls her beyond containment. She's this force in the 1950s in Black communism and Black left feminism and all the things. Charisse Burden-Stelly calls her the foremother of revolution, and she's in a lot of Angela Davis's early work. And yet, and Miriam Kaba, No Selves to Defend, all this stuff on mass movements for defending political prisoners. On she basically is there in all of these key moments in the history of the Black protest tradition, and yet she hasn't become as well known as some of the other figures. And we can talk about why that is, but why they always teach Malcolm X versus MLK or something. But the Claudia Jones literally was on the vanguard of all of this stuff that is in the book. So the self-determination, the Black Belt, this nation within a nation thesis that becomes core to the theory of internal colonialism, becomes core to Black nationalism. She's writing about that. She's charging the U.S. with genocide. The Civil Rights Congress, or their We Charge Genocide, the William Patterson and Paul Robeson and all that petition. The call to Negro women in 1951 that she's organizing with the Sojourner for Truth and Justice. They're charging the U.S. with genocide specifically for the targeted killing and imprisonment of Black people in 1951. And then she's also naming triple oppression. So this intersection of kind of race, class, and gender oppression in that becomes a core to the Third World Women's Alliance, to Black feminism, to Kabahi, to Fran Beal's Triple Jeopardy. This idea that and this is is in all of it, so central to all of your work, that that you're able to see something differently when you experience those forms of intersecting oppression. And so I guess, relatedly, I'd love to hear a little bit about you talk in your work about these insights from Black feminism, both the urgent necessity to center the most marginalized, And this is described in different ways in your book, but also in movement work. The proximity to pain should be closer to the power, and there's different ways of phrasing that. But then also the Black feminist invitation that Black liberation, in fact, holds the key to liberating all of us. And so I wonder if you could just share a little bit of that from your book.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting. Should almost start from the invitation that Black liberation holds the key to liberating everyone, right? And the question in Black political thought and movement has been, well, whose liberation, right? What does liberation look like? So I think one of the important interventions of Black feminist thought and praxis is to say that Black liberation holds the key to liberating everyone, but only if we pay attention to the Black people who have been historically discarded within movement, whose concerns and interests get pushed to the side. And the truth is, it's really only Black feminist thinkers who could have made that intervention, right? Because they were the ones, as you were pointing out, that was actually experiencing this. Otherwise, you could have just maintained a hegemonic cis heterosexual male positionality on what Black liberation is. And so I think what has traveled from these initial articulations of intersecting oppressions, triple oppression, et cetera, has been the urgent necessity to make sure that our political lens is trained towards those who are historically marginalized, as well as developing a praxis that allows us to interact with one another in a very different way, that allows for space for those who have been historically marginalized within movement, that allows for the voice of a Black trans woman to take up as much space, if not more space, than a Black cis heterosexual man, right? And so that's why I think it's important to switch that Black liberation holds the key to liberating everyone, but then whose liberation? And then that is how and where that the idea of moving from the margins to the center, as Bell Hooks would put it, gained so much purchase and became what I would say irreversible paradigm, not perfected or necessarily agreed to by everyone. But I feel like this intervention at the center of movement and movement practice, not just what movement claims to do, but the approach that movement tries to take to moving towards liberation. I don't see us going back to a pre-Black feminist intervention that is about centering the historically marginalized as the mechanism by which Black liberation can hold the key to liberating everyone. That's how I would think about that. But kind of pivoting a little bit, but in a similar vein, with regards to the importance of the presence and the past and the interplay between the two, right? The Black feminist interventions of the 60s and 70s and how that has played out and become the center of movement now, right? I was struck but not surprised in your book about how many resonances or reverberations the history you're recounting, because most of it is in the past, has in the present, and impressively how carefully you weave all of it together, right? And here I'm thinking about things that people will be familiar with: family separation, the criminalization of radicalism and critique, like what we can and can't say about what's happening and has been happening in Gaza, for example, or systems of forced transportation and detention, surveillance technologies. And these are just to name a few of the way that you show us and give us an account of the past that rings true to the present. And in many respects, your work for that reason and other reasons is arriving at the right time, really at the right time. So why is it important for you in a broad sense, to see the United States in both the past and the present as a purveyor of this approach to wielding state power you're calling prison imperialism. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what the stakes of making that association are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of it comes from this genealogy that we're talking about. So, you have that beautiful line in your book, which is the flip side of what you're saying, which is, yeah, also white supremacy is killing everybody, just you more slowly, motherfucker. The Fred Moten line, but that. So one approach is through this. If you really pay attention to people who internationalize the struggle, they're all peace activists. They're all anti-imperialists. And so, Claudia Jones has this line that the book opens with that, imperialism leads to racism, leads to fascism. They're all grappling with kind of militarized violence on a global scale. And because Black Studies always has had a transnational framework, attending to the lives of Black people all over the world. And because each of these activists have come up against the limits of, regular politics as usual or law. So they've, realized how law is a source of violence and not a source of redress. They realized the limits of domestic politics. And so they had to reach beyond that to find an anti-colonial analysis, decolonial analysis. And so part of it, is to show this history of prison imperialism, which is a way of naming both prison expansion and the circulation of those techniques of social control, of kind of racially targeted. One way of thinking about it is the outsized use of racial violence in consolidating state power and both and empire building. So, you see that and you see those overlaps. So one of the things that prison imperialism names is the overlaps in the assumptions and the core policies of foreign policy and criminology or penology or prison policy. And those core assumptions about preemption, deterrence, containment, incapacitation, retribution, there's like all of this overlap, the same kind of set of experts and white policymakers and, slave owning in the 19th century and then, global war profiting in later centuries. I mean, that core set of assumptions is so baked in, across the centuries. And it's not to like flatten out change over time. Although, I always have this argument with historians. They're like, isn't your work presentist? And they mean that's activist because you're drawing these lessons from the past to speak to the present. And this is, one of the major differences in approach. And my answer in grad school, and I think I still stand by this, is like, no, you're the most activist person in the room because you are actively maintaining the status quo. Like if you're writing shit that's just about the pastness of the past or like the niceness of a chair in the 1700s or whatever, like your ass is actively maintaining the status quo. That's activist, that's presentist. It's just like, but if you feel the weight of inequality and if the present, the horrible inequalities of the present are grinding on you and people you love and everything else, then there's a moral imperative to understand the past and look at the past, not as a kind of antiquarian curiosity for the pastness of the past, but in fact, to understand the root causes of the crises of our time.
And also to show how these crises were not inevitable. They were manufactured, they were made. And that also gives space to understand that they too can be changed.
Yeah, set of contingent policy choices. Yeah, and there's so many ways to trace that. So I guess that's, to get at your question about the stakes, and we can, there are different ways to think about it, but the stakes are movement building. The stakes are a global abolition movement, right? Because and the stakes are thinking about both undoing harm and repairing it in really big, broad, capacious ways. Like you can undo specific things once you can draw a through line and name something like, prison slavery has been the longest lasting and farthest reaching piece of federal prison policy that has both, if you don't, this is Angela Davis and How Prisons Are, our prisons obsolete. She says, you don't want to live in a world governed by racism. And this is demonstrably racist. Prison prisons, there's a similar thing, which is like, if you don't want to live in a world governed by colonialism, and you could show that this is demonstrably colonial, these logics, right? And here's where they went, and here's how they pioneered them over here and brought them back to, it helps you, disavow and also repair and also, do the work of that, it raises a moral obligation, essentially. But yeah, so the stakes are partially to end violent practices, and so there are things like you can end prison slavery. Once you've drawn that through line from the convict clause, exporting slavery and military servitude as punishment for crime to places like Panama and the Philippines and all over. There's a movement to end prison slavery, and the National Network for Ending Prison Slavery says, no slavery, no exceptions, and they have abolished it in several states. It didn't get enough votes in California and Louisiana last year, but there are people like Jalil Muntakim, who's in the book, who did 50 years as a political prisoner, and one of the things he's campaigning for in New York is to end prison slavery. And similarly, you can end the 1033 program, and all these things that youth-led Black social movements in the last 10 years have shown us need to be abolished. But then the flip side of that, right, is not just staying there. And this is what, your work and so many people's work, this is the kind of exciting world building aspect of all of this is, abolition as world making. So this is, I think, depending on what audiences you're speaking to and whatnot, some people wrongly associate it with just, defunding the police or ending something or whatever. But as all of the activists in the movement have known now and in the past, this is about creating an alternate world. And so, I'll put the stakes question back to you and ask if you can take us through a little bit the way that you break down abolition as world making into its constitutive elements, the way that Black joy emanates from everyday youth, feminist, and queer practices, how care can be profoundly anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, in all the most liberatory ways. This is the group that I worked with, Alternate Roots. They talk about the need to abolish all forms of oppression everywhere, which pretty much succinctly sums up the call to, but then the question is that everyone's question always is what then, what next? And that, is about building this Black future. So just take us through a few of the things that people will find in here, the practices and the highlights that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that abolition is a political aspiration that has an open-ended end, but that can be practiced in the present, right? As a pathway towards that open-ended end, right? And that begins with kind of what we were talking about before, which is just an observation of the world-destroying, painful structures that do violence and harm on all kinds of registers, both in the U.S. and abroad. Perpetrated by the U.S. in large part, or at least supported by the U.S. So that begins with that recognition, right? And with that recognition, you come to, or you might arrive at the conclusion that nothing that presently looks like what we have, the structures that we live under, is going to provide, or was meant to provide, the sort of life worlds that we would prefer to live when we give ourselves the opportunity to ask what we prefer, rather than just accepting what we have. And so I think in movement, from my observation, and people have heard about Black joy and the prevalence of care in all different kinds of ways, especially in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. But those signal real-life abolitionist ways of living, as Eric A. Stanley would call it, right? Joy is not just a response to pain, but it's also a prefiguration of what can come if we pursue an abolitionist way of living towards unmaking and remaking the world. And so these micro levels of world making through the lens of abolition are central to getting us and pushing us forward, also because they signal the things that we need to shift within ourselves. Care is as much about that as it's about anything else. Care is about recognizing that our violent institutions will not be a recourse to liberation, and that we wear the scars of our violent institutions, social relations, and heteropatriarchy, right? Even if we espouse a different view, we wear that, we perform that. And so one of the things that's been beautiful about movement and other radical ways of thinking, being, and doing is precisely the desire to not just abolish what's out there, but abolish what's inside through practice, right? And lots of failure and experimentation, of course, right? But care is about the aspiration to be better, the aspiration to treat each other differently, the aspiration to think collectively and socially rather than individually, the aspirations to recognize the joy in someone else could be a light for you, right? And so I think those are how you get to a version of care that's anti-capitalist, that's anti-racist, that's anti-sexist in truly liberatory ways.
Beautiful. So I know we want to close by just reading an excerpt from each of our, from your coda and from my epilogue. And before we do that, I just want to remind folks, if you've thought of questions, to put them in the chat, because Peter's going to jump back in and share some of those. And I think we'll probably have at least 15 minutes for Q&A and audience questions, and we're excited to hear from you all. So do you want to, should I do the history and then you do the future, or shall we?
Sure, let's do that.
All right. So this is a piece from the epilogue that actually, I haven't read. I mean, Chris suggested. I've been reading different bits and pieces, and it's really fun to have this conversation, and also just to have someone that reads and engages your work so deeply, and then suggests passages to read, because you're also doing this crazy thing, which is how to share a book, how to talk about books. So this is from the epilogue. It's 2 paragraphs at the end of 197 that kind of overlap with Chris's book, but don't tell the story nearly as well as his book does. Amid the worldwide Black Lives Matter movement, or Black Lives Matter uprisings of some 26 million people in the United States alone, the United Nations issued a statement condemning systemic racism in the United States in 2020. What this meant for those who have died and are dying, and for those whose lives are daily threatened by the unjust imprisonment during the ongoing pandemic, remains to be seen. The uprisings are now considered the largest and broadest protest movement in US history. They build on years of organizing for Black lives and have inspired solidarity protests around the world. Demands to free longtime political prisoners and to release all people from dangerous and unnecessary confinement in jails and prisons intensified as the COVID-19 virus was disproportionately killing people in prison. As new freedom dreams, policy proposals, and future-making practices take shape, many are looking to the Black and Indigenous traditions of anti-racist and anti-colonial organizing and movement building for inspiration and lessons learned. Across the long history of the struggle against state violence, activists in the US anti-prison movement have pushed for an international theory of change rooted in a decolonial analysis of racial violence and an expanded framework of human rights. Perhaps the global prison abolition movement will become the new human rights paradigm as we move from the last utopia to the next.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that passage, and not just because it resonates with what I've been doing and what I've been observing, and is a very clear distillation of where our work overlaps. But that the last utopia to the next, right? The idea that abolition, whether you're going to call it prison abolition or just abolition, whatever it might be the container for human rights, the vehicle for the radical transformations that we all want to see. And so I think that's a powerful distillation of things. And I will just say before I read the coda or a couple of paragraphs in the coda in mine, is to just repeat that it's been a pleasure to engage your work. It's a very important intervention. It forces, and we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but it forces the internationalist lens in very important ways. We were gonna, maybe we can get into this in the Q&As about the degrees to which we can call this a new age of internationalism, or what that looks like or how it came about. But your book certainly is a work that is hearkening to that necessity, the vibrancy and vitality of its past, and the possibilities that it might engender for the future. So thank you for that. I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs in the coda, and I'll just start by saying that it makes references to some quotes that precede it, but you won't need it to actually understand. Césaire's searing critique in the opening lines of Discourse on Colonialism were written over 70 years ago, but the spirit of its condemnation remains true to this day, with perhaps one small amendment. Our decadent and stricken civilization is not dying. It's already dead. There's nothing left to redeem or revive, nothing for us to mourn. Without hesitation and absent remorse, we must abandon our dreams and say farewell to our old beliefs and former friendships. The burial is long overdue. Let's hurry to our shovels. To believe otherwise, to remain impervious to social decline, the farce of so-called democracy, the deprivation fostered by widening inequalities, the creep of fascism, the coming climate catastrophe already here, is the height of self-deception and a betrayal of the first order. Look around. Violence traces the capitalist world system in ways both visible and sometimes hard to see. It always has. Social contradictions abound and spread, producing a fog that obscures our collective agency and interdependence when not properly addressed. They always will, if we let it. The choice is ours to make.
Beautiful. Peter,
Invite Peter back.
Yeah, jump back in. I think we have at least 15 minutes for chatting, and
questions have begun to come through. Anya asks, how can we learn from the mistakes of history? How can we make a constructive impact on dismantling systems of oppression and imprisonment that continue to exist?
Yeah, I can start. This is a great question, and I'll just say that Anya is my sister, who inspired a lot of my approach to activism. I also see my aunt here. You'll see in the acknowledgements, these two women were bold, fierce activists in their own right, in all kinds of justice movements. And so I don't know if she's trying to softball me or what, but we have to learn from history. And the broader point for justice movements, I mean, this is in both of our work, is there are things that we can end by studying root causes. There are things that we can seek to say, like, this is no longer, prison slavery is not something that this country should be about. Should be, they should be exporting U.S. style structural racism around the world is not something that should be happening anymore, is actually making us less safe, and all these other things. And then there's this hard work of movement building that Chris lifts up, and so many people lift up, that comes from this kind of generations of struggle, and that we, if we pay attention to, we can really learn a lot from.
Yeah, I would just add to that, another way of learning from the past is paying attention to the past, as you do in your book, and mine's more about the present, but it does some retrospective looking backwards. And a part of that is the lessons that come directly from people who have mounted these types of struggles, right? To not, as Fanon would instruct, dismiss what we might perceive to be their past failures or inadequacies, but to really appreciate materially how certain conditions of possibility, certain ideas arise at certain moments because of those conditions of possibility, and not in others, right? So learning from mistakes, from successes, I think is central to, and this is that intergenerational work we were kind of talking about before, is central to being able to not just recognize that we can end things, but how to do so, right? And how not to do so too.
Roz has a comment and some questions. To carry Anya's question forward further, I think I've spoken to both of you about how the dynamics of movements naturally evolve. Certain ways of moving people are effective in a particular moment and not in the next. What are the living dynamics or newest innovations of moving people in the now? For example, social media was key amongst young people led by Black feminists in recent years for moving masses. Is it still? What is key for communication today? And it goes on.
Yeah, well, I think social media still is an important place for galvanizing energy and getting people to, concrete locations through that energy. One of the things that I think that is different, that might be different now as we move perhaps into a different conjuncture to post-Black Lives Matter world, I'm not sure, it's up in the air, is definitely the response to organizational, institutional structures that align with nonprofits. I think that some of the issues that have arisen behind the scenes after social media, when actually trying to build organizations, is how those organizations align and how that alignment impacts the mission that was at the root of the organization to begin with, the radicality of its politics, again, how people treat each other within those contexts. So that to me is definitely one thing that we might see that to be a definitive shift away from what we've been seeing. And again, the galvanizing on social media is going to continue to happen. That's still an important space for that. But once you get into actual organizing and actual organizing structures, I think people are going to look long and hard at, how those organizations align and to whom they become beholden to.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit before this started. I'm waiting for Chris's next book about some of these digital, both organizing and dangers. The rise, not just of AI, but of incarceration. The Center for Media Justice right there in the Bay Area has done some really, really good work on this. James Kilgore and Ruthie Gilmore have talked a lot about this, but that kind of like carceral, the way that the carceral state expands in the name of reform. So there's a piece in the book that talks about incarceration being prison imperialism's next frontier, that people think, ankle monitors or something like that, like a kinder, fuzzier cage is okay. And then it just gets more and more people get brought into that system in the name of reform, and it does harm on even larger scales. And so I think, thinking about these technologies, both in terms of their powers for connection and communication and mobilizing, like Chris was saying, and also their dangers, both for expanding the carceral state, for destroying civil liberties and freedom of speech and all these other things. And, the kinds of things that, Chris was mentioning too, like the, Twitter effect of like more followers, bigger is better, more contentious is going to get you more, and then the groundedness of struggles over placemaking, over concrete social and economic entitlements, remembering that to do the actual stuff in real life, that Chris writes about in his book, the ratchet realm, all these spaces that are very real physical spaces where people build trust in ways that just haven't been replicated online. So anyway, we're waiting for Chris's next book on this.
Nate has a question for you, Benjamin. I wanted to ask if you've reflected on the absence of internal colonial analysis in the past few decades within the academy, and if in your intervention you're calling for a reclamation of such an analysis. Do you think the absence of this analysis has performed a counterinsurgent function similar to the transition you point out in the book?
Yeah. I think there are ways that academic conversations ebb and flow, and probably within academic circles, we think they're much more influential and important than they actually are in the world. And so I think in movement circles and on college campuses, there's that idea has always been interesting to people because of the way that it names certain logics. And then, as academics tend to do, they get all busy about definitions and start fighting with each other about what things mean and blah, 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 and kind of ruin it for everybody. So, I think there's, no, but really seriously, Assata Shakur kind of talks about this in the way that an analysis of internal colonialism helped them build solidarity with Puerto Rican nationalist and indigenous movements, but then also, and then that which led to a kind of Black nationalism, which, as Chris was pointing out, in its masculinist version, she says you can't have nationalism without internationalism because of the way that any kind of nationalism. So internal colonialism did really interesting and important work in the world. I think it's coming back as a way of naming these connections between systems of social control abroad and at home. And then it also circulates in popular discourse in ways that, Chris Hayes, an MSNBC commentator, has a book called A Colony and a Nation, and that says, there's a legal system that treats Black people one way and white people another way. And that's another way of naming a phenomenon that a lot of people have named. And what's another recent one? Thinking about caste. Isabel Wilkerson has a way of thinking about racial control through caste. I think each of these things are as useful as they get people to reckon with kind of the inequalities and violences of the past in ways that motivate them to do something toward the solutions. And so, I think there, to the point about a counterinsurgent function, knowledge is part of that. But counterinsurgency is really invested in using outsized violence to intimidate and control broader swaths of the population. So there's this famous quote there's an FBI agent writes to J. Edgar Hoover. He's like, Black youth and moderates must be made to realize that if they succumb to revolutionary teaching, they'll be dead revolutionaries. And so the counterinsurgency strategy of use of outsized violence to traumatize broader swaths of the population is something that was pioneered in war making and has come back. I think there's a similar, probably like silencing as things go in and out of fashion, but I would be careful, to equate that with, the targeted killing of revolutionary leaders.
Christopher, did you have a comment or?
Oh, well, no, I mean, I guess it just to piggyback off of that and maybe move in a slightly different direction with that. I mean, I do think there is discursive counterinsurgency, not to equate it with the same types of counter insurgency tactics that you were just referencing. Not to collapse them on each other, but and this, to kind of go back to what Roz was, one of the things that Roz was asking about. I definitely do think that social media and hashtags as phenomena are very easily captured and made something else in a way that I might call counterinsurgency, right? And maybe it's just a word choice thing, but some of it seems quite intentional, or the way corporations can take the language of Black Lives Matter, or you could paint it on a street or whatever, and then it's like, okay, look at everything that we're doing, or the people in Congress can wear, can't they, those are that's less discursive and more aesthetic. But if we think about those things, as it's useful to me to imagine them as tools within a larger set of counterinsurgent tactics, these being particularly unique in their ability to spread precisely because of social media's role in initially spreading the movement. So that's what I'd add to this.
Yeah. I have a question actually for the both of you. Where do you stand in relation to the work of Frantz Fanon at this particular moment? Because you mentioned Aimé Césaire earlier, and of course that brought my thinking to Frantz Fanon. And what is of use to you in his work right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we both have epigraphs, or he's heavily quoted part of the black radical tradition, because, like Aimé Césaire, he writes from an anti-colonial critique, decolonial critique. One of the things, in reading Chris's book, and he talks about coming of age during what was called the Arab Spring, that series of uprisings, along with the Black Lives Matter movement, was, they were reading Fanon. People were like, oh, this is a revolution. They should be reading these kind of like Western texts about how to create a nation state that has liberal rule of law. And no, they're reading about how to decolonize, how to deal with the continued effects of neocolonialism. And so, one of the ways that I reckon with Fanon's work in this moment, and this is also, to Nate's question, is through the continued relevance of a decolonial framework for understanding solutions to these violent histories, and understanding that that's grounded in struggles over placemaking that we've seen, in various protest movements and direct action, but also has this psychological dimension, that he writes about really clearly. And so holding both is really important, because I think there have been debates in the past that, some things should or do take precedent over others. And I think shifting from the interpersonal to the structural, and being able to hold both, is something that the Black radical tradition really does well. It was a blind spot for white Marxists for a long time. And so the Black radical tradition came along and said, no, racism has a motive force in history that needs to be contended with. And I think that's one of the things that this Black stream of anti-colonial thinking and decolonial thinking really helps us work through.
Yeah. Fanon has, as was mentioned, has a central place in the thinking and theoretical lens of the book. But to say what might be particularly useful about Fanon's work, particularly The Wretched of the Earth, I would say, is how materially grounded it is, and how it's largely about lessons, right? The book teaches us from the material ground that he offers, but it teaches us about, how to organize across classes, things not to do across classes. It doesn't shy away from what we might implicitly know is necessary, but try to avoid, which is that transformation is going to be violent on all kinds of levels, and we should stop pretending like it's not, or that we can avoid it, right? Or that it's not going to be disproportionately, leveled towards us, and we need to understand that and be prepared for that. So I think all of those lessons were always useful since Fanon wrote, or since he was alive, but I think can be particularly useful now for the reasons that I just cited, and then can, completely be ways through which one can understand various situations geopolitically.
Wow. Well, we find ourselves running out of time, and I'm really ever grateful to the two of you. Have you any final parting comments before we wrap?
I hear my baby, and she's calling me to put her to sleep.
The final comment that I'll make is that, having had many conversations around the book, this was one of the first times to have one in conversation, right, back and forth, about more than just my book and thinking, and that was a lot of fun. So I'm grateful for the opportunity that City Lights has provided for that to happen, and for Ben for writing a great book that is very much in conversation with mine.
And grateful to all of you for sharing virtual space with us. And I know this will be the first of many conversations.
Well, thank you both for gracing our halls. I mean, that was a very compelling, very enlightening talk. So many great references. And I love the way that both your books, complement each other in ever so many ways. So Benjamin Weather, congratulations on this very important, wonderful new book.
Thank you.
Christopher Paul Harris, likewise, congratulations on the success of your new book. And again, such a pleasure and an honor. There they are. And thanks to all of you in the audience. As always, you help complete the circle. Tonight's program has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Please take care. Be well. We hope to see you all again soon.